Thank you. And could you please provide your testimony with regard to fracking and rights of nature?
Yeah. So when it comes to fracking in Europe, I'll be mainly speaking about the situation in Europe. The situation is a bit far less dramatic than in the US, and I don't have as dramatic pictures to show because in Europe we're in early exploration phase. The situation in Europe is quite diverse. There are some countries, like France, that have banned fracking, even though there's a lot of pressure on those fracking bans, for example, in France and in Bulgaria, by the industry to overturn these bans. There are some regional bans in some countries. But then there's also countries where there's active exploration going on, particularly in Poland, the UK, Romania, Denmark. So there are actually drillings going on and things are going wrong, and I'll come back to that in a moment. There are countries where there are some licenses, but where there's no actual drilling happening. And there's other countries where they've sort of hit the pause button and said, we'll look at the environmental impacts and we'll make the decision 1 to 5 years from now. That's the case in Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So that's a bit the situation for now. We're in the early exploration phase. The story in Europe is mainly of locals, local communities, local businesses standing up to the industry and to their central governments who want to push fracking to say, no, we don't want this industrialization of our landscape in densely populated areas. And that we just don't want it, and that there are other alternatives available to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. But even with those very few wells that have been drilled, we noticed that there's been a lot of problems. In the UK, the first fracked well immediately unleashed an earthquake in an area that has never had any experience of earthquakes. So they didn't do the proper seismic testing, and so of course there was immediately an earthquake, which also led to a deformation of the well casing. So this is, of course, immediately a problem in the UK, in the Lancashire area, where from the first time they fracked, they immediately got it wrong. So, of course, with the deformation of the well case, you get a much higher risk that methane and other chemicals leak into the groundwater. There's been a case of improper treatment of wastewater in the UK, where improperly treated wastewater was dumped into the Manchester shipping canal, so just in surface water. So this is obviously, and yet the UK government keeps on insisting that they have world-class regulation, and that whatever happened in the US cannot happen in the UK, but the facts on the ground contradict that. In Germany, it's mainly related to conventional oil and gas drilling. We've had toxic wastewater leaking through pipes, and benzene has a very carcinogenic compound, has leaked into the groundwater, and there's been very high cancer rates in some areas in Lower Saxony, where we've had decades of conventional oil and gas drilling. In Poland, we have evidence that methane was leaked was vented into the atmosphere because they couldn't flare it, and so raw methane, a very powerful greenhouse gas, was also leaked into the atmosphere. We've had an illegal dumping of wastewater into a gravel pit, and also the Polish government, they're being put before the European Court of Justice because they refuse, despite all the industry best practices, they refuse to implement a baseline testing, so an environmental impact assessment prior to drilling. And so this is something, the management of this industry has been absolutely substandard in Poland, and they've just opened the door and offered a lot of licenses for free to the industry to come and frack in Europe. Luckily, the oil and gas prices have dropped, and also the geology didn't cooperate. But still, it shows how open our governments have been to push this onto local communities. A last example I want to give is in Denmark, where the French company Total fracked a well, but there they failed to submit the use of a specific chemical for the drilling to the environmental agency of Denmark. So the environmental agency had to go and shut down the operation. So these are just a couple of examples from a couple of wells, and everything that could go wrong essentially has gone wrong in Europe. So I guess my case would be that Some people say this industry can be regulated, that we can have best industry practices, that we can have best available technologies, that we can have stronger enforcement of our rules. I say that this industry, as has been shown in Europe, that even if you have very few wells, and we know that this industry doesn't operate with very few wells, but only with hundreds and hundreds of wells on a yearly basis, plus the injection wells and so on, that this industry is non-regulatable, that this industry needs to be banned, and that, and particularly in the year that we're at the COP21, where we're discussing sort of a make or break deal on the climate, that we have to put fossil fuels and keeping them in the ground on the agenda. We cannot just talk about the climate in fairly general terms without really addressing the issue. And the issue is fossil fuels. We have to get off fossil fuels. And to get off fossil fuels, in the first place, we need to stop digging, drilling, fracking. We should also mention that a lot of fracking happens for oil and not for gas, so really the climate benefits. Most of the fracking targets oil, definitely when oil prices were high. So, and then, of course, all these new resources that we can extract by the use of fracking, they just add to our unburnable carbon resources. With the existing reserves that we have already of conventional gas, we already exceed our carbon budget. So the more exploration we do, it's essentially adding to the resources that we cannot afford to burn. So this is why we make the plea at the COP21. We're also organizing the global frackdown. We have a letter going out to our leaders saying that we need to ban fracking in the year of the COP21. 1,250 groups in 64 countries have signed on to this letter, and we say that fracking is not a solution. Fracking is the problem. And so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Thank you.